Good evening, everyone, and thanks for attending this event. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the inaugural lecture by Professor Rico Isaacs. So Rico is a professor of international politics here at the university, and his work sits at the intersection of culture and politics, exploring how power operates not only through institutions and parties, but also through identity, symbolism, and everyday life. His research is focused particularly on authoritarian, nationalist and populist politics in the post-communist space, especially in Central Asia. So following his studies at Kingston University, the London School of Economics and Political Science and Oxford Brookes University, over the past 2 decades, Rico has built an international reputation as one of the leading scholars of post-Soviet politics. He's the author of Political Oppositions in Authoritarianism, published by Palgrave in 2022, Film and Identity in Kazakhstan, Soviet and Post-Soviet Culture, published by Bloomsbury in 2018, and Party System Formation in Kazakhstan Between Formal and Informal Politics, published by Routledge in 2011. These works reflect both the depth and range of his scholarship, from the inner workings of political parties and parliaments to the cultural dimension of cinema and identity. This evening's lecture, Are We All Post-Soviet Now? 6 Lessons from Studying Post-Soviet Authoritarianism for Understanding the Contemporary Politics of Disorder, promises insights into some of the most pressing political issues of today, informing wider public policy, and also considering some challenges that inform those who work on studies of democracy and the rule of law. Much commentary on the rise of populism traces its origins to the global financial crisis of 2008. Professor Isaacs offers a different argument. He suggests that the roots of our current political malaise lie earlier, in the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Drawing on 20 years of research into authoritarianism and failed democratization in former Soviet states, he distills 6 lessons that help us make sense of today's global climate of populist politics. An inaugural lecture is both a celebration of past achievement and a statement of intellectual direction. This evening we celebrate a scholar whose work has consistently combined empirical depth with conceptual innovation, and whose research speaks directly to some of the most urgent political questions of our time. I'm sure that we can all see the challenges that are posed by the current political environment in many parts of the world, and the need for responses to these challenges informed by comparative and historical insights. We'll all have no doubt much to learn from the insights in this lecture. Please join me in welcoming Professor Isaacs.
Okay, thanks everyone. Can you hear me all okay? Yeah. Great, wonderful. I'm going to start just with a very few quick thanks, as is often customary. The first thanks go to the 2 people who aren't here actually, but maybe they'll watch it, who knows. The first is Sarah Whitmore, who's my PhD supervisor at Oxford Brookes, and the other is Professor Gary Browning, who was also my second supervisor at Oxford Brookes. And I think both of them have been intellectual mentors, but then colleagues and also friends over the last 20 years. The second set of thanks is to colleagues, actually. Well, all of you for coming, but in particular colleagues. It's no secret that higher education is going through a turbulent period right now in the UK. And one of the things that makes meeting some of those challenges easier is the colleagues that I work with. So I want to thank them for coming and generally being a good, supportive and smart bunch. Finally, just some thanks to friends and family, and in particular Liga. So we've been through some tough times, but she's always got my back. So thank you. Right, now one of the things is that's often quite customary with these inaugural lectures is that you're expected to give some kind of intellectual journey or biography, and I wasn't particularly interested in doing that. I started thinking about that, and I started making a list of conferences that I wish I hadn't been at, papers that were only considered promising, grants that were rejected, and meetings I also wish I'd never attended. So what I wanted to do instead, I've posed this question: are we all post-Soviet now? And I'll give you the answer, which is no, not really, but maybe. Not really, and that's good social science. But actually, what I wanted to do was reflect on to some extent, what my research has been doing for the last 20 years. It was something of an existential exercise. What have I been doing for the last 20 years? What does it all mean? I think Mike's introduction was very generous, actually, and he read more or less the abstract I wrote for the talk about 6 months ago, and I thought, oh, did I really say that? Okay, so what I wanted to do with this talk is reflect on what my research can speak to in terms of thinking about where politics is now in the world. There's this sort of question of disorder, the rise of populism, and so on, and thinking about. And actually, in that abstract, I do mention this. There's a lot of research that talks about the rise of populism being rooted in the global economic crisis of 2008. And I have been thinking some time. Well, actually, when you look at some of the authoritarian practices that are emerging into liberal democracies across North America and even Europe, you can identify traces of those in some of the practices, authoritarian practices that exist in post-Soviet politics over the last 20 years that I've been studying. The other thing is I'm going to talk a lot about Central Asia. That has been largely my site of interest for most of my academic career. And this talk is also about saying why Central Asia matters and why what Central Asia to some extent can tell us about contemporary politics. I really do want to leave time for questions, and I have a habit of anecdotes and going off track, so I want to try and keep to time as much as possible. So what I'm not doing in this talk is suggesting there are equivalencies between the types of authoritarian practices that we can observe in Central Asia and the post-Soviet space and what is happening to some extent in already established liberal democracies. I'm not suggesting that the West equals the post-Soviet space. I'm not making a causal claim that because it happened or has been happening in Central Asia, in Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan, or even Russia, which is obviously not in Central Asia, but we have a Russian specialist in the room, that it's happening, that's a reason why it's happening in the West. And I'm also not suggesting that Central Asia is also uniquely authoritarian either. It's not an exceptional case here, and often, studies of comparative authoritarianism can draw lots of parallels between the ways in which authoritarian rule exists in the Central Asian republics and other areas of the world, not least in Africa or Southeast Asia. Just very quickly, two quick notes about terminology. The first is the term post-Soviet. There has been a lot of literature and pushback, particularly within Central Asian studies and scholars from Central Asia about the term post-Soviet. They find it as a sort of a term of colonialism. And even in my own work, certainly in the last 5 years, I've tended to use the term post-independence rather than post-Soviet. But I use this term here merely as a kind of a more kind of understandable public descriptor. And also, it is a fact, particularly with the early development of authoritarianism in the Central Asian republics, that they were post-Soviet in the sense that you had the elites who had been part of Soviet rule in Central Asia take over as the rulers and elites of the independent republics. And so there is this kind of continuity and legacy that makes them, to some extent, post-Soviet, at least in institutional terms, I think. The other thing is the term authoritarianism. I use this, again, it's quite a contested concept. I use a definition that's often that's devised by Juan Linz, who was a Spanish political scientist. Basically, authoritarianism is about centralized decision making, power being held by usually a single person or a small group of elites. Often, authoritarian regimes don't have a guiding ideology, in the sense that perhaps fascist or totalitarian regimes that you'll know from history in terms of Nazi Germany or even the Soviet Union under Stalin. There's limited pluralism in authoritarian regimes, and there's a tendency for what Linz calls some form of sort of guided mentality, which is basically a tendency towards nationalism and to some extent patriotism as well. Just to be clear on that. So what I'm trying to do to some extent in this discussion is to treat post-Soviet authoritarianism in Central Asia as a laboratory of power, a laboratory of power. It's, what can we take from studying power in Central Asia to make sense of the ways in which authoritarian practices or authoritarian techniques have developed and to some extent traveled across space. Across sort of geographic space. So this just in case, because again, Central Asia is often a region on the periphery and in the margins. This is Central Asia that I'm talking about. It's 5 former Soviet republics of the the Soviet Union. And I'm specifically wanting to talk about practices and techniques, not regime type. So obviously, there's lots of discussion, certainly in public discourse, around the extent to which Trump is authoritarian or so on. I think that largely misses the point. We shouldn't be focused on labeling. We should be focusing on actually the practices and techniques that are finding their way into liberal democracies, or the ways in which liberal democracies are encountering them now. So I think the central question really is this. It's kind of like a conversation has turned, and I think that's how I was trying to pitch this inaugural. Back in the 1990s, when actually I started studying Russia and Russian politics, the question was, how do you make these post-Soviet states democratic? And lots of money was spent by international agencies and NGOs and governments, the European Union, on trying to promote democracy across the post-Soviet space. But I think today's question is much different, because actually a lot of that funding has dried up. A lot of the impetus seems to have dried up for it, or at least the energy for addressing these issues have dried up. The question I think we're posed with today in the year 2026 is, how do democracies become less democratic? What are the techniques and practices that somehow are eroding democratic norms? And I think that's the point I'm trying to sort of get across in terms of this inaugural lecture, is to think about, if in the 1990s we were asking what can the West teach post-Soviet states about democracy, today we might pose the question, what can post-Soviet authoritarianism teach us about how democracy erodes? And I put this, funnily enough, actually, I put this picture up because it reminds me, this is obviously 1991, Yeltsin is standing up to the military sort of conservative right-wing coup that was taking place in the Soviet Union at the time. It more or less led to the fall of Gorbachev and the collapse of the Soviet Union. I was about 13 or 14 years old at this time. And obviously, when I teach political socialization to my students, I always sort of pitch this as, this was the moment, obviously, when something grabbed me. And I've been trying to kind of figure out what happened then. I was 13, 14, I was an adolescent, and all of a sudden things got very, very confusing. As they do when you're that age. And so I've probably spent the rest of my life trying to somehow figure that out, which is how we've ended up here. So what I'm going to do, and basically, is try to draw 6 lessons that's come from my research that deals with this question of what post-Soviet authoritarianism might be able to tell us about the erosion of sort of democratic norms in established liberal democracies. 6 lessons are quite fashionable these days. There's often these airport books, it's 12 lessons for this. So I thought 6 was enough. There's only so much we can take. Okay, lesson 1. The first thing is that authoritarianism is complex, okay? It's often very subtle and it's insidious, and it's more than coercion. So the typical assumption, or the common sense assumption about non-democratic authoritarian regimes, is that it's about the security services. It's about, if you can remember 1989 and Tiananmen Square, it's about the military security services, and it's about repression, rigged elections. But actually what some of my research did very early on is focus on the role of institutions in producing autocratic or authoritarian stability. And this idea that authoritarianism doesn't just work through coercion. There's a very influential paper that was published in 2013 by Johan Gacheski, which is called The 3 Pillars of Stability in Authoritarianism. He talks about co-option being one. So the ways in which authoritarian regimes will seek to co-opt opposition elites, other types of elites, and bring them into the system. He also talks about the role of legitimation. So these are the stories, the narratives and the discourses that authoritarian regimes say about themselves to engender legitimation. I'm going to say a little bit more about that shortly. And then he does also talk about coercion obviously being very important. So I think the key thing here is that authoritarianism works through institutions. Institutions have an important role to play. Parties, parliaments, elections, constitutions, they do matter in authoritarian regimes, even if the outcomes are controlled, but they matter. And so this paper that I published in 2010 in the journal Democratization talks about how in Kazakhstan, the president of Kazakhstan at the time, Nursultan Nazarbayev, the former first secretary of the Communist Party of Kazakhstan, in the early 1990s, he faced a power struggle with parliament. And so to overcome this, to shore up his position, he basically bought off members of parliament by offering them jobs here and there. There was kind of an informal deal. I'll come to informality in a moment. And he was able to shut down parliament, rewrite the constitution, so it's centralized power in the presidency. And I think what that demonstrates is the ways in which authoritarianism is often, it's managed. Okay, it's not just about imposition, it's about a process of management. And institutions have an important role to play in that. And in fact, the ways in which parliaments and elections and constitutions are often adapted to meet certain threats to the regime are really, really important for authoritarian stability. It's not just about bullets and the security services. It's actually about the law, often. And why does this matter now in terms of thinking about liberal democracy? Well, on the one hand, I think the point is here that actually authoritarianism works through rules, not necessarily coups. A very good example is Viktor Orban in Hungary. And we've seen, Orban is not, in Hungary, he's not, he's been in power for 16 years now. He's not abolished elections. He's not banned the opposition media, but he has, he has restructured the sort of regulatory institutions and public broadcasting. So the state becomes a very routine instrument of the governing party. And basically it turns that political bias in favour of the governing party, which is Fidesz and Orban, into an accepted feature of democratic governance. So it's almost like you don't notice necessarily that it's happening. To some extent, I don't want to talk too much about him because I'm not sure it always helps, but Trump in the US, there's a degree to which the ways in which Trump has used his position to go after legally go after particular opponents, and reframing the presidency itself as a vehicle that allows it to punish political opponents through the machinery of law, says something about the changing nature of the discretionary use of state power. that a president can come to power and have that discretion and use it against their rivals. What matters is less about Trump. It's the extent to which that then becomes an embedded norm in the system after Trump has gone. Lesson 2. Formal institutions are not just decorative, we've already established that, but actually what's really key is their relationship to what's called informal politics or informal institutions. When I started out studying Central Asia about 20 years ago, the predominant discourse or the predominant sort of framing within Central Asian studies was the importance of what they call clan politics or tribal politics, informal politics. This is this argument that essentially politics is determined by familial relations or kinship relations. There was a kind of historically determinist aspect to that. What I did this was my PhD essentially, but that was the first book. What I argue in that book actually is that to some extent that's not necessarily true. Formal institutions matter and they play an important role in terms of structuring political competition. In Kazakhstan, and actually across many post-Soviet countries, but in particular in Central Asia, the political system is very hierarchical. It's like a pyramid. At the top, you'll have the president. Below him, you'll have a series of elite groups who will compete for power, resources, and the favour of the president, and the president plays a kind of arbitrary role in distributing those sources. Political parties in Kazakhstan played an important role in structuring that elite competition. And you'd find these very influential elite groups, I mean, people call them oligarchs, who would use political parties as a way to ensure that they were able to kind of get access to those resources through sort of parliamentary means. The important thing to note about this is that essentially, whilst formal institutions like parties matter in this context, they're often determined by informal politics. So there's this integration between the formal and the informal. So when I'm talking about informal politics, I mean things like patronage, or what's often called patron-client relations. So someone is in a position of power to be able to give out resources and jobs. You then owe your loyalty and fealty to that particular individual. And that's how a lot of this takes place. And generally, there is also, although again, formal institutions matter, there's an uneven playing field. So one of the probably the most interesting things to emerge from this research in this book is a chapter you'll be all delighted to know, which is on the law on political parties in Kazakhstan from 2002. I'm sure you've all read it and familiar with it. But actually that law is really key in explaining the management of opposition in Kazakhstan. Because what it was written in a way which was very violable. It was very easy to break. So basically it's then applied selectively. If a political party emerges, typically associated with a member of the elite who may sit in opposition to the president, the Ministry of Justice is basically able to apply that law really strictly to stop that party from being registered and participate in elections. In cases when it is a pro-regime friendly party, it doesn't apply that law at all. So this is this kind of the uneven playing field. I was driven a lot by, for any sociologists in the audience, the work of kind of Max Weber in a lot of this research, his kind of work around different types of authority, and in particular the idea of the neo-patrimonial logic. And that's the relation, this fusion between the formal and the informal in explaining authoritarian durability. My notes are all messed up. Uh-oh. That's all right, I've got it. Page 3. So, how does this kind of translate at all into, observations we can make about European democracies? Perhaps, I think, in the case of Hungary and Turkey, again, laws are followed, procedures are respected, outcomes are predetermined, though, often through clientelism, often through media capture and regulatory pressure. And I think we often see it, certainly in the case of Hungary, again, the ways in which Orban has sought to kind of capture state media, but you can also see that in Turkey as well. You know, no, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to talk about Trump in America, sorry. So, where are we? Lesson three. Lesson three. So this is important. Some of this may resonate when you think about contemporary politics. Personalization and charisma matter a lot. So in Central Asia broadly, but Kazakhstan in particular, authority is personal, okay? It's not abstract. And what I mean by that, what matters, or often what matters, is the personal aspect of authority, the personal power that somebody has. The office gives you the ability to distribute that power and distribute resources, but it's actually the personal prerogative of being able to do so matters. Political leaders in Central Asia are frequently depicted as strong, stable, and that was Theresa May's 2017 election campaign slogan, strong and stable and protectors of the nation, and historically necessary. So the discourse around Nazarbayev, particularly after 2010, which I'll come to why that's significant in a moment, was that Nazarbayev, the president of Kazakhstan, emerged at the right time, exactly at the right time in Kazakh history to protect the nation, to ensure it's a prosperous nation and a stable nation. Largely those things are not true, by the way. And in the book on film and identity in Kazakhstan, which came out in 2018, I trace some of these discourses and narratives about the personalization of leadership. And actually cinema played a particularly important role, firstly in sort of state-driven films which depicted the sort of historical necessity or the historical legitimation of Nazarbayev to previous Kazakh leaders of centuries ago, but also there was a series of films which, because you don't have to, I watched them. There was 6 films made about the life of Nazarbayev, 6 films, yes, and I have watched them all. Again, this really important part of this personality cult that develops. And personality cults are particularly important in Central Asia. I mean, I've talked about Nazarbayev. There's also in Turkmenistan as well. There's been 2 presidents in Turkmenistan. Well, 3 strictly speaking, but and they've all developed really kind of highly eccentric personality cults, and they become an important part of the legitimation of leadership. And I think the important thing I want to say about this actually is this is not propaganda. It's actually it's legitimation. And what I mean by that is these are the types of inputs that authoritarian regimes can put into the system. Through discourses, they can be through policies and legislation. They're inputs that are meant to try to engender the belief in society of the right and proper rule for these leaders to rule. And charisma is part of this. Again, it's another Max Weberian kind of concept around authority. Charismatic authority is basically the idea that someone has the right to rule simply through their own charisma, in terms of their unique and special abilities to address the problems of a nation. Does that sound familiar to anyone? Now, the problem with charisma is that it has to be performed constantly to make sense. Because once material conditions fail, the social contract breaks. So if people's energy bills go up, all of a sudden these things about this person being the specific special person to deal with all of the great things for the nation don't read so well. So it has to be performed constantly. And of course, when it comes to charismatic authority in this way, there are many, many parallels. Trump, okay, who talks about him alone being able to fix it. Who's that? Kirsty Nolan the other week was in the, I can't remember, the Mike will know, the committee where she's sort of saying Trump is the greatest president. That's charismatic authority. Orban does this as well in terms of protector of the nation. Putin does it in terms of this idea of protecting kind of Western Christian civilization, that these people put themselves in a position to suggest that they alone can fix things. Farage does this in terms of his man of the people thing. In fact, I watched a Reform Party broadcast the other week. It was set in Walton-on-the-Naze, actually, which is part. My parents used to have a caravan there, actually, and it's called "We Will Be." I think it was called "We Will Be Great Again," and that was, to me, it was a perfect kind of example of this form of charismatic authority. This attempt to say, "I'm the person to do it. I'm going to make things great again." Lesson 4. We're getting there. Okay. This is a slightly controversial argument, I think, but I think it's one worth making. Lesson 4 is that when economic debate is closed, culture becomes the battlefield. So my work on culture and identity often demonstrates that when economic alternatives disappear, political contestation relocates to the cultural field. It relocates to questions of identity, morality, and tradition. So, and in Central Asia, I think you certainly saw this. This is a bit more complicated, but certainly in the case of Kazakhstan, you know, there was a fundamental acceptance of neoliberalism and sort of free market capitalism. It wasn't really economic liberalism, it was economic illiberalism because it was very selective about who got what. But the problem is there aren't discussions about economics, not real discussions about different types of economic systems in Kazakhstan in this way. And so to some extent, economic distributional conflict becomes depoliticized. And political contestation moves to questions of cultural conflict. So, you know, there's lots of sort of anti-LGBTQ, gender ideology, nationalism, and lots of kind of in public discourse, and you know, coming from members of parliament, lots of narratives about what it means to be, you know, a traditional Kazakh man or a very compliant Kazakh woman. And actually, Liga and I wrote a paper together that came out in 2021 on Latvia's failure which kind of pitched some of this argument. And that article was about Latvia's failure to ratify the Istanbul Convention, which is basically a convention aimed at kind of recognition of international standards on combating violence against women. Okay, should be something that should be fairly uncontroversial. And in this paper, we argue, I think maybe more implicitly than I would have liked, I think, but we argue that because economic debate in Latvia is closed, the parties are more or less all in agreement about the nature of the economic system. There's no real kind of efforts to offer a different economic type of system. What we found were like religious actors in particular and some right-wing nationalist parties basically used the failure to ratify or pushed for the non-ratification of the Istanbul Convention and drove forward very sort of what's called a sort of anti-gender ideology, anti-LGBTQ narratives. And I think the point I want to get to here is that what this demonstrates is we hear the term culture wars a lot in public discourse. I think they have a very functional value. And they're there often to displace, I think, material grievances. You know, not least, one of the things I think often that is missed is the question of whose culture war is it? I don't think they're accidental. I think they occur for particular reasons, often for the expediency of particular interest groups, political elites. My external examiner, Neil Robinson, actually, who Edwin will probably know, I thought he wrote a really good paper about Russia's culture war and where that emerged as a consequence of Putin's kind of failure on economic legitimation after the global economic crisis. And it's interesting, the shift in discourse, in Russian political discourse after 2008, shift to the cultural field once Putin came back as president in 2012. Okay, let's do the lesson 5 and 6 quickly. Okay, right, lesson 5. Protest is material, not merely ideational. So I've done a lot of study around, or research around, sort of protest and opposition in Central Asia, particularly in Kazakhstan. I wrote a paper on hipsters in Almaty, mostly because Almaty is in the south of Kazakhstan. I used to end up going to a lot of hipster coffee shops. Who would have thunk? And I ended up meeting people and lots of artists and so on. And one of the things that sort of this paper talks about is a sort of is a tendency of, when it comes to protest in Kazakhstan, genuine kind of opposition that really challenges the regime comes around from questions of material questions. It's about land, it's about energy prices, it's about wages. And one of the problems with the young hipsters in Kazakhstan, the reason why youth is quite important in Kazakhstan is because 50% of the population are under the age of 30. But one of the problems is that their focus tended to be on ideational politics. So it was about the politics of individual rights. It was about human rights. They really focused on democracy, parliamentary reform, all this kind of stuff. And that's great. But when you've got many people living out in rural areas who are struggling with even individual energy security, these two groups of people are unable to speak to one another. And actually, to some extent, they're literally not able to speak to one another because there's also a language gap. Lots of young hipsters that live in Almaty, the city, they tend to speak Russian. The sort of the rural class tend to speak more Kazakh. So in Kazakhstan, some people may remember in 2002, there were big sort of very bloody protests that were a consequence of an economic shock. The rise of LPG gas prices went up by 50% overnight, and this essentially led to a wave of protest, the breaking down of the social contract between the people and the state. So the broader point here is that certainly in the context of authoritarianism, in the context of authoritarian regimes, progressive politics will fail when it neglects material conditions and it over-intellectualizes grievance. And when we over-intellectualize grievance. And I think, anyone in this room can think about, Western democracies and Western economies, and obviously in the UK we often talk about the cost of living crisis, but we see precarity every day, we see declining welfare, we see a housing crisis. And I think for progressive politics, if we are not addressing these questions and focusing too much on ideational questions, this is not to say they're not important, then there's going to be, I think, a struggle to meet some of the challenges around the emergence of authoritarian practices in this sphere, and particularly some of the culture wars that I mentioned in relation to lesson 4. Okay, we've got to lesson 6. I'm nearly there. Right, so the last book that came out was 4 years ago called Political Opposition in Authoritarianism in Kazakhstan. And what I did, this is probably my favourite thing I've ever written, because to some extent it was the culmination of about 17 or 18 years worth of research. And what I do is I tell the story of the development of opposition in Kazakhstan. And what we find is that very early on, as I described in relation to one paper, formal opposition is closed off. Elite oligarchic opposition becomes neutralised, meaning there's no space. And the only space for opposition to emerge is often from the ground up, from grassroots. And that's the only space. And the problem is with authoritarian regimes, and certainly in the case of Kazakhstan, is that there's a kind of information gap. They're often not very, very aware of what is going on the ground. So when you do get shocks, when you do get protests, they tend to come as a complete surprise to the regimes. What's important to note about this type of opposition, certainly as it appeared in Kazakhstan, but I think we can see it in other places. Kyrgyzstan is another good example in terms of Central Asia. It's often very fragmented, it's leaderless, and it's very heterogeneous. So actually the two groups I was speaking to in relation to the previous lesson, the kind of rural class and then this kind of hipster urban cosmopolitan class, they're very kind of distinct. They've got grievances and they're protesting, but they don't really speak to one another. And I think this is the paradox that lies at the heart of authoritarianism and authoritarian practices, which is the more they close the system down, the more they close spaces of dissent down, the more they close the ability for pluralism to emerge, the more exposed they are to eruption. Now, the outcomes are uncertain, and particularly even what happened in Kazakhstan in 2002 didn't lead to democracy, and it never was going to. But it demonstrates that these, despite all the efforts of using formal institutions or using legitimation, using personalization and charisma to try and keep regimes stable, they're always exposed to eruption. So I think in the in the case of contemporary democratic backsliding, which we're seeing to some extent across Europe with the rise of populism, civic protests, when institutions fail, when parties are not there as channels to represent opposition interests, civic activism, grassroots activism is where political contestation relocates. So the point is, even if you have liberal democracies emerging into sort of forms of authoritarian practice, hope does come from the bottom up. So, to conclude, are we all post-Soviet now? No, of course not. That would be, it was a provocative question to ask, and I already knew the answer. But, history is different, obviously, the context is different. This is not about equivalence. But yes, we can see techniques, we can see practices, and we can see patterns that kind of travel across time and space. And so if I do have a message that finishes this inaugural lecture, which to some extent is a kind of justification for my existence over the last 20 years, it is that actually we should study authoritarianism seriously, and we may be under pressure in liberal democracies not to talk about it so much. There is every possibility that across Europe, if we do see the rise of right-wing nationalist parties coming to power, that they may seek to audit particular courses and audit particular topics that they see as challenging to their particular worldview. So we must study it seriously. We must protect democracy actively as much as possible. And I think most importantly for me, anyway, as someone that's spent time in Central Asia and spent studying Central Asia, we must learn from the places that we often think are marginal, exceptions or dismissed. I'm always drawn to Walter Benjamin on this in his idea that even studying the smallest, tiniest little thing will tell us probably more than we can ever imagine. And I think just to finish on a slightly cynical note, authoritarianism in Central Asia was built and maintained through the repurposing of institutions rather than their abolition. And I think which is precisely why democratic erosion in liberal democracy is often hard to recognise when it's happening. The real danger, therefore, is not that democracy suddenly end, but that they will continue to function while gradually becoming something else. What makes democratic erosion dangerous is precisely its normality. So each step along the way may seem defensible and legitimate on its own, even while overall the system quietly changes. Thank you.